The 1997 anime adaptation of Berserk is perfect in almost every way because it stayed true to the source material and didn't take as many liberties as the movies from the 20th century and Berserk 2016 did. But if we had one gripe with it, it's that Berserk 97 skipped over one of the most important characters in all of Berserk, Skull Knight. We now know that the Wandering Wraith is the OG Guts because it's his story that led to the circumstances we see unfolding in Berserk's current timeline, but this got us thinking. Was Skull Knight really so unimportant back in the day that he could have simply been ignored? We don't think so, and that's why we've decided to rank every appearance he's ever made in the manga, from least to most important, because that's how massive of an impact he has on the story. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. This is every Skull Knight appearance ranked. Chapters 174 and 176. Before we dive into our list proper, we'd like to just mention a couple of things about it. Skull Knight has had over 30 appearances in total. If we went through them individually, we'd be sitting here all day long, so instead, what we've done is group together those appearances that are connected to each other. That way we can talk about their importance a bit easier, and while this video might still end up being pretty long, at least it won't feel like we're dashing all over the place trying to make sense of it all. So, having said that, let's talk about our first grouping of chapters, chapters 174 and 176. Both of these chapters feature Skull Knight for a grand total of 3 panels, and he isn't even doing anything important in them. That's not to say that he isn't doing things, it's just that he's done stuff that's much more important elsewhere in the story. In chapter 174, following the conclusion of the incarnation ceremony, when a blinding light covers all of St. Albion and makes Guts take his eye off the Tower of Conviction as he notices Zod's arrival, Skull Knight, standing upon the ruined battlements of the structure, points in the direction of the light. Guts sees him, sees his finger, and turns his gaze towards where Skull Knight is pointing to find Griffith back on Earth. While this moment is important for Guts, for Skull Knight, it's just something he already knew was going to happen, and so his involvement in the reveal is limited to pointing it out. Then, after Griffith departs St. Albion on his new right-hand demon Zod's right palm, we see Skull Knight surveying the fallen tower from a cliff overlooking that holy city, as the narration tells us that this was the moment when the shape of the world began to crumble. That statement came from the unseen narrator of Berserk and not Skull Knight himself, which is why we won't attribute its importance to him. And that's why these two appearances from the aftermath of the incarnation ceremony are at the bottom of our list. Chapter 368. 368 was Skull Knight's last appearance in the manga as of now, and while it was during an emergency, its importance in terms of the overall narrative isn't quite as significant as some of his other appearances. In this chapter, the collapse of Elfhelm and Skellig Island begins after the Moonlight Boy turns into Griffith and destroys Elfhelm's grand cherry blossom spirit tree. The reason behind the destruction of this village of mages is quite straightforward. They represent the strongest collective threat to Griffith's power and authority, and so when he figured out that he's traveling to Casca's location whenever he becomes the Moonlight Boy, he decided to use it to his advantage. Griffith opened a rift in the fabric of reality itself after he secured Casca, which caused Skellig Island to essentially split in two after experiencing a massive earthquake. While he flew off on Zod, blobs of bloody spirits similar to the ones that appeared at St. Albion emerged from the rift and started devouring every living thing in sight. Isidro, Yzma, and Serpico were all there with the Flower Storm Monarch at the time, and Isidro and Serpico, having been present for the incarnation ceremony, knew that they were surrounded and screwed. But before they became grub for the bloody blobs, Skull Knight appeared and cleared their surroundings, telling them to flee the place because they were no match for these beings. He explained that these blobs, like the ones from St. Albion, were akin to the ancient wardens of Skellig Island, and that Isidro and co. weren't a match for them, so they should flee. That bit of information at least has some sort of significance because it connects both Skellig Island and the Tower of Conviction to a single event and basically proves that the blood blobs are kind of the trapped souls of those who went through the first eclipse. That's why Skull Knight says that men cannot control them, most likely because these blobs used to be Void's followers. Also, when Isidro ignores his advice and decides to stand and fight, Skull Knight has a bit of a proud daddy moment where he says that while the collapse of Elfhelm might have been fated, to oppose it was only human. It shows his continued faith in humanity's ability to rise above hatred and evil and reaffirms his status as a defender of mankind. But apart from these two things, this Skull Knight appearance doesn't really progress the story in any way, which is why it's the second to last entry on our list. Chapter 203. Chapter 203 is quite an important chapter for Berserk lore in general. Yes, we know we didn't include it in our top 10 most important Berserk lore chapters, but that's because we were focused on things bigger than a breakdown of magic systems and the like over there. This is one point where we're willing to take a hit and say that yes, we should have probably included this chapter, but the reason it's so low on this particular list is because Skull Knight's involvement is minimal. He shows up at the very end of the chapter for a couple of pages, and then isn't seen until chapter 219 rolls around, but the reason his appearance here is more important than the previous two entries is because chapter 203 reveals the very reason Flora was so willing to help out Guts was because of him. Turns out, Skull Knight was the one who told her about the imminent arrival of a fellow struggler and requested that she aid him however she could. When Guts first met Flora, he was confused as to how she knew he would come to her Spirit Tree mansion, but chapter 203 answers that question. Flora asks Skull Knight whether he's helping Guts out of pity after seeing some of himself in the guy, or if he's just using him to further his own vengeful agenda, but Skull Knight simply says that Guts, like himself, is a person guided by causality. Sooner or later, he was going to meet Flora, or someone like her, to get the exact breakdown about elementals and the nature of magic that he got between chapters 200 and 203, so he figured it would be better to guide him towards his old friend, Flora. The importance of this is that it tells us two things about Skull Knight. One, he's actually looking out for Guts beyond the simple premise of their stories being similar and therefore related, and two, he knows that in order to defeat an enemy like Griffith, magical knowledge and companions are crucial, both of which Guts acquires in this chapter. So the overall impact of Skull Knight's request to Flora is quite sizable when you consider the series as a whole, but he himself doesn't play a massive role in moving things along directly, he just facilitates this meeting and lets Fate and Flora handle the rest. So we think chapter 203 being this low on our list is justified, but if you think otherwise, we'd be happy to read about why that's the case in the comment section down below. Chapters 222 through 226. Speaking of getting involved in matters related to Guts and causality directly, well, Skull Knight requests that Flora take care of and prepare his fellow struggler for the battles to come. Chapters 222 through 226 see Skull Knight take a more active role in helping out with the latter. That's because chapter 222 introduces perhaps the most important weapon in Guts' arsenal after Dragon Slayer, the Berserker Armor. Turns out, Skull Knight didn't have one request to make, he had two, because Flora's words at the beginning of the chapter imply that he was the one who asked her to prepare the armor for use again. We see her applying a talisman to it so that when Guts uses it, his ego doesn't immediately collapse and he isn't instantly consumed by the Berserker Armor's malicious ode. But what's interesting to note here is that Skull Knight tells her that there's no way she doesn't know how dangerous the armor is, implying that he too is connected to it in some way. Flora tells him that she's well aware of its nature, having been its guardian for many years, but she says that it's all the more reason that Guts would need it on his journey ahead. Skull Knight laments the fact that this armor was going to be used again and calls that fact karmic, but Flora stops him from saying anything else and expresses her belief that fate isn't a circle, it's a spiral. Guts and his companions were fated to make the same mistakes that she and Skull Knight had made in the past, because, in her view, the spiraling nature of fate itself necessitates that things go differently this time around. Skull Knight reluctantly agrees with her by saying certainly, but before he can say another word, Flora and her Spirit Tree mansion are attacked by Griffith's apostles. The reason for this is the same as the reason he destroys Elfhelm later in the series. Flora and her little pocket of sunlight were both hindrances to Griffith's grand plans for the future of humanity and existence itself, and so killing one frail old lady was more important to him in that moment than liberating cities and gaining popular support. When the apostles show up, Flora laments that her spiritual powers have declined so much that these monsters were able to break through her magical barriers without any difficulty, but Skull Knight immediately jumps into action by calling his steed and galloping into enemy lines, all to ensure that his friend dies in peace instead of being consumed by demons, thoughts of her powerlessness, and literal flames. While Skull Knight is able to kill quite a few apostles, he isn't able to prevent Flora's demise, which was inevitable. But we do get a rather cool team-up moment between him and Guts out of this tragedy, tragedy, which sadly lasts as long as a moment because then Skull Knight becomes occupied with fighting the Immortal One. As he engages Zod in battle for the umpteenth time, they both note that this battle isn't like the ones they've had in the past. Skull Knight fights to protect the dignity of Flora's death, while Zod is here on a job personally handed to him by Griffith, which is to ensure Flora's death. As they dance their familiar dance with each other, Guts explodes out of the body of an apostle that tried to devour him in such a brutal manner that it temporarily makes his opponent Grunbeld think he isn't even the same person anymore. But when Zod spots the Berserker armor on him, he turns to Skull Knight and talks about the memories the very sight of that armor brings back, calling it nostalgic, and asking if his rival intends for Guts to take the same path to hell that he's on. That's the last time we see the subject of this video during the mini arc that introduces the Berserker armor to the universe, but Zod's words and the questions Skull Knight posed to Flora in chapter 222 suggest that the latter was the previous user of the armor, and that it was the reason he exists as a Wandering Wraith in the present day. All of this is really important to the plot because from this point onward, the Berserker armor becomes the reason Guts is able to survive epic battles with the likes of the Sorcerer Daiba, the Kushan Emperor Ganishka, and even a malign old deity called the Sea God. And that's why this sequence of 4 chapters are among the most important Skull Knight appearances throughout the manga. Chapters 142, 155 through 158, 160, 162, and 165. While the Berserker armor's introduction involves Skull Knight's past and sees him engage several apostles for the sake of his friend, an argument can be made that that isn't his most important apostle hunt. That's because he hunts another apostle during the Conviction arc who becomes the very reason that Griffith's incarnation is even possible. He doesn't know it at the time, considering he was simply doing what he usually does, but as Skull Knight's appearances ramp up throughout the Conviction arc, it becomes clear to both us and him that his battle with the Egg of the Perfect World could have prevented one of the most evil rituals in the whole series. It starts with chapter 142 when he's reunited with Guts for the first time since the Eclipse. He notes that his fellow struggler seems to be in good health and informs him that he's hot on the heels of an apostle. When he realizes that Guts too is headed towards St. Albion, he realizes that Casca is already there and informs the Black Swordsman that he needs to hurry up, otherwise she's going to die. He explains the nature of the incarnation ceremony to him, which he calls an imitation of the Eclipse with the opposite result. While the Eclipse drew Griffith into the astral world, the incarnation ceremony would see him return to the physical world, and he says that nothing he or Guts does will be able to change the latter's outcome because he believes causality is inevitable. When Guts responds by saying both Skull Knight and Zod were wrong about his death, which should have occurred during the Eclipse, Skull Knight reconsiders his personal ideology and decides to gamble on Guts' intuition because he acknowledges the fact that, as a man bearing the brand of sacrifice, Guts has his feet planted in both the physical and astral worlds. He admits that the God Hand aren't all-seeing, and that thanks to people like Guts, minute details can be changed during important junction points, and those details' compound effect could ultimately defeat the God Hand. Skull Knight makes the call to gamble everything in those moments and details, and leaves Guts with the promise of seeing him again at St. Albion because he knows their paths are bound to converge. The next time we spot Skull Knight is in chapter 155 when we see his silhouette on the exterior of the Tower of Conviction as he stares down the egg. As soon as the apostle notices him, it tries to make a break for it, but not only does Skull Knight catch up with him, he also saves someone else's life along the way. Around the same time he and his magic horse are Spider-Manning it down the tower, the prostitute called Luca falls from a window attached to said tower. For Skull Knight, grabbing her as she fell just to save her life is not an unusual occurrence, for he fights for humanity and will save as many humans as he can. When he lands on the burial grounds outside the tower and puts Luca down safely, she initially confuses him for the Grim Reaper before realizing that this guy was something else entirely. Before she can ask him anything about himself, Skull Knight squares up against the Egg of the Perfect World, and though the egg is quite quick and nimble for a non-combatant apostle, he only manages to wound him. He questions himself, wondering whether he hesitated from striking the demon down for some reason, and is concerned with the egg's apostle form because he looks an awful lot like a Behelit. And as he searches for the egg and Luca, we get the origin story of the former from his own mouth and learn that his purpose in becoming an apostle was to create the quote-unquote perfect world. By the time he's done explaining who he is and why he's doing what he's doing to Luca for no other reason than simple loneliness, Skull Knight managed to track down the egg's lair and destroy it while he saved everyone's favorite female Berserk character after Casca. But by then, he realizes that he was too late and that the egg had nearly fulfilled its purpose. As massive blobs of blood and miasma form upon the surface of St. Albion, Skull Knight brings Luca to safety and tells her to get as far away as she can, but she chooses to go back into the jaws of the lion because she needs to find Nina before she dies, and the fact that she doesn't even think about asking for Skull Knight's help impresses him quite a bit. He thinks that Luca is either ignorant and foolish or extremely brave, but now that the incarnation ceremony was underway, he couldn't help her even if she solicited his help. That's because at every important junction event, Skull Knight is bound to fight the Immortal One, who shows up just in time to see the beginning of his master's return to Earth. He remarks that all flows as though parallel to that time, most likely referring to the eclipse that turned his life into living hell. The reason we think that his conviction arc journey is more important than his involvement in Guts acquiring the Berserker Armor is threefold. Firstly, we get to see Skull Knight hunting an apostle for the first time in the manga, which is quite a rare occurrence considering he himself doesn't show up that often. Secondly, he saves Luca's life, who would go on to become integral to the events that transpire in Falconia when Rickert enters the city. And thirdly, despite calling Guts a leaping fish whose effects can cause ripple effects throughout the causal stream, Skull Knight remains a slave to his own outlook on things, because despite having proof that one can challenge causality and emerge victorious, he chooses to remain bound to the concept. Had he truly believed what he said to Guts was applicable to himself, he'd have made a better effort at killing the egg of the perfect world, because Skull Knight would have realized that he's the guy the God Hand plans on using to change and enslave the world. This is why we've basically clubbed together all of his conviction arc appearances, because they form part of a larger narrative that we've just spent close to 5 minutes explaining to you guys. And in the end, his failure to comprehend that fate is a spiral, not a circle, is what prevents him from going all out against the egg and putting an end to the threat he posed to the world. In a way, Skull Knight's rigid way of thinking was responsible for Griffith's successful incarnation, and this won't be the last time he inadvertently ends up helping the God Hand, but for the purposes of this video, the reason Skull Knight's conviction arc appearances are so important is because we get to see him in action properly, and we learn that all his cryptic prophetic warnings come true almost always in some shape or form. Chapters 236 to 238. This trio of chapters is required reading for a number of reasons, chief of which is Skull Knight's big mouth. It's weird saying that because usually he keeps spinning yarn after yarn of esoteric knowledge that accurately predicts the terrors of the future, but in these chapters he does the exact opposite. For starters, he admits that he's the former owner of the Berserker Armor, which pretty much sets the notion that Skull Knight used to be Supreme King Geiseric in concrete. But he also draws parallels between his life and relationship to Guts, and compares his friendship with Shirke to the one he had with Flora way back in the day. Chapters 236 through 238 see Skull Knight in a weirdly expositional mood because not only does he bring up his past multiple times, he also diagnoses Guts' symptoms after using the Berserker Armor once so accurately that Guts defaults to making grand claims about himself as a coping mechanism. Skull Knight tells him that each time he fights as the Berserker, he will lose many things, not just his 5 senses and control over his neural pathways. He also says that if he wanted to continue living as a human being, he better be judicious with his use of the armor. On top of that, Skull Knight also offers a genuine ray of hope to a fellow struggler for the first time since they met each other, because he says that if they manage to reach Elfhelm before they die, the leader of the island's mages, a figure known as King Hanafubuku, would have the power to restore Casca's mind. He does add a warning to this ray of hope by saying that even if she returns to normal, there's no guarantee that what he wishes for her will be what she wishes for, which turns out to be true when we see Casca experience intense PTSD flashbacks whenever she lays eyes on Guts. This is because he himself is associated with the eclipse in her subconscious mind, so as always, Skull Knight's claims and promises are more of a monkey's paw kind of situation. We also see that Casca is thoroughly interested in being a motherly figure to the Moonlight Boy, who she later realizes is her demon child after regaining her sanity. In our opinion, this is what Skull Knight meant when he said that piece of dialogue about Guts and Casca having different priorities in life because one wants vengeance while the other wants motherhood. But the official jury is still out on this one because it hasn't been a long time in universe since he first pointed out the difference between what they had and what they wanted from life. Skull Knight gives you answers and solutions that could genuinely solve all your life problems, but he doesn't teach you how to navigate life itself, which comes back later to bite him in the ass. Still, the fact that he made multiple references to his elusive history unprompted and actually helped Guts by giving him a direct answer for the first time is enough for us to deem these chapters in our top 5 most important Skull Knight appearances. And now that we've entered the top 5, it's time to begin the countdown. Chapters 359 through 363. In fourth place, we have Skull Knight's first proper appearance in the Fantasia arc, which is extremely important considering these 4 chapters explain his past and what got him to this point in life. At the end of chapter 359, he shows up on Elfhelm after a very long time, and in chapter 360, we see him talking to a person that connects Berserk's past, present, and future. That person is Guru Gedfring, who has been alive since the first eclipse, and based on the fact that Gedfring calls Skull Knight Your Majesty before correcting himself, we gain the understanding that this skeletal warrior and the ancient Supreme King Geiseric are one and the same. Chapters 361 through 363 exist to verify this claim because in 361, after catching up with Gedfring for a while, Skull Knight takes Guts to visit the dwarven blacksmith that made both the Berserker armor and his current armor. Once there, he has Hanar bestow upon Guts the final moments of his last day as a human, which is made possible through his ownership of the Berserker armor. And then comes chapter 362, which basically confirms that Skull Knight was a product of the first eclipse and the Berserker armor's existence warping Ode by showing us his last confrontation with Void as a human being. And then, in chapter 363, we get further evidence that the Supreme King plus the eclipse equals Skull Knight because he goes to a mausoleum on Elfhelm to pay his respects to his dead lover, and Danon shows up to ask him if that's all he's here for, while Guts and Shirke freak out at her uncanny resemblance to the woman that Skull Knight lost to evil all those years ago. We'd go deeper into these chapters if we hadn't already discussed them extensively multiple times on our channel, but the gist of it is that chapters 359 through 363 are the first chapters to openly discuss Skull Knight's past as Supreme King Geiseric without outright saying those exact words. Chapters 118, 219 through 221, and 303 through 304. At first, you might think that there's no connection between these chapters because they're like 100 episodes apart from one another, but trust us, there is a method to our madness because all the chapters we've just mentioned have one thing in common. That is Skull Knight's secret weapon that he's been quietly forging, or rather refining, to take the God Hand down once and for all. In chapter 118, we see him arrive in the Misty Valley shortly after Guts' deforesting battle with the Apostle Rosine. He's appalled by the carnage that he's witnessing and realizes that such destruction could have only been caused by the one man he calls his fellow struggler, the Black Swordsman. He wonders out loud whether Guts can stay on the warpath considering he'd turned a former abode for elves into a land that looked like it had been scorched by hellfire, and after acknowledging that doing such a thing would have been quite difficult for a regular human being, he does something that most people would consider odd. Skull Knight rummages around in a tree hole, and when he pulls his hand out, he has a behelit in it. He proceeds to swallow it and then moves on to his next task, but this scene left us baffled because we thought deceased wraiths like him didn't need to eat. He also does the same thing to the Egg of the Perfect World's behelit, which he swallows after attacking him the second time around and setting his hideout on fire. For a while, we thought that Skull Knight just liked snacking on behelits for some reason until the Clip-Off mini-arc hit full swing, and we saw just why he'd been dropping behelits down his neck as if they were Cadbury cream eggs. In chapter 219, Skull Knight rushes into Clip-Off from Flora's Spirit Tree Mansion because he senses Slan manifesting inside the former. He clears a pack of trolls that were surrounding Isidro and Shirke's refugees, and when he finally comes face to face with her, he retorts to her calling him Your Majesty by saying that she's the whore princess of the Uterine Sea. Slan's attention is taken from her precious Guts as she sends waves of trolls and ogres to deal with this pesky intruder, but even as he's slicing and dicing them, Skull Knight has enough time to fire off some advice to Guts. While he deals with the apostles, he tells Guts to deal with Slan's partial manifestation by blowing her guts out with his arm cannon and then using the Dragon Slayer to finish the job. But it's when Slan's quote-unquote death causes Clip-Off's dimensional gates to slowly close that the real important thing about Skull Knight's sudden appearance is revealed. He's finally come up with a solution to the God Hand problem, and that's where those behelit snacks factor in. Turns out he wasn't eating them just to have funky face-bearing fecal matter, he was doing it to refine them within himself and create a blade capable of trapping God Hand members for all eternity. His hope was to keep this weapon concealed until his final confrontation with them, but when Slan's forced partial manifestation and death caused Clip-Off's very space to warp and collapse, he decided there was no time like the present to test out his new weapon. He swallowed his sword up to the hilt, and when it emerged, it was covered in active behelits that allowed him to cleave space itself and travel from one point to another with zero obstacles. That was the first time we saw the Sword of Actuation, and considering the fact that Skull Knight was planning on using the God Hand's own powers against them by banishing banishing them to the Abyss with a weapon linked to the Abyss, we were skeptical about its efficacy because his plan seemed too normal to work out. Sure, his test drive of the blade was highly successful as he rescued Guts and himself from Klipov's collapse by cleaving open space and arriving at the place where the former's companions were gathered. But we always thought that trying to beat someone at their own game is quite a tricky thing to do, because if they're anything like the God Hand, they'll see you and your strategies coming from a planet away and turn them against you. That's exactly what happens at the end of chapter 303, where we see Skull Knight appearing behind Griffith in his femto form, hoping to get rid of him once and for all by trapping him with the Sword of Actuation's spatial strikes. Instead, Griffith anticipated his arrival and turned the very sword stroke that was meant to seal him like a mafuba into the great roar of the astral world, which plunged humanity and Earth itself back into a state of fantasia when monsters and elves and the like were still commonly seen and believed in. To be fair to Skull Knight, Griffith does have the power to peer into the future and anticipate his moves before he even makes them. But if we're going to play devil's advocate for a second, we can also say that in his pursuit of the Inhumans of the world, Skull Knight should have known that his sneak attack on Griffith wouldn't work, even based on his own track record. Skull Knight has made a habit of attacking the God Hand and its minions at important junctions and rituals, so one didn't require the power of prophecy to decipher his pattern of movement. Still, the fact that Skull Knight even thought of creating a weapon specifically to deal with the God Hand is massively important, because the Sword of Actuation will be critical to how this story ends. And speaking of the story's ending, Chapters 52, 79 through 80, and 87 through 88. All of these chapters are immensely important Skull Knight chapters because what he does in them sets the tone for the rest of Berserk, and all of them are set in or around the time period of the Eclipse. In Chapter 52, Skull Knight showed up to shoo off a group of apostles that decided to get a snack in before the feast. As he dealt with them, he unwittingly saved the life of Rickard, who would go on to become the only person to have physically harmed Griffith after he became a God Hand member. This ties back to all the exposition work Skull Knight was doing between chapters 236 and 238, because in amongst all the good news, he also mentioned that getting to Griffith might be impossible for a guy like Guts. Post-incarnation, Griffith had gained so much power that he had essentially become an absolute existence. He was like a character in a story who was also writing said story, which basically means that he was in full and complete control of himself and all those who believed in him. But Rickard had spent much of his post-eclipse time coming to grips with the fact that the Falcons were gone, and in doing so, he mourned them, made his peace with their deaths, and moved on with his own life. It was only after the Great Roar that he had to move to Falconia, because it was the only safe spot for people being chased by monsters in the West. He didn't do it because he really wanted to see the guy, and in fact, when Rickard saw Griffith in chapter 337 and slapped him for even suggesting that they work alongside the very apostles that killed and devoured their friends, we realized that Rickard exists outside of Griffith's story. This means that Griffith might be vulnerable to anything Ricky does to him, which is why him being saved by Skull Knight in chapter 52 is so important, because he's the only remaining Falcon who have been lucky enough not to experience the eclipse. That's not all. Chapters 79 and 80 introduce the second best rivalry pairing in Berserk, Skull Knight and Zod. And this meeting is only made possible because of Skull Knight's involvement with Rickard and his centuries-long habit of attacking junction points and humiliating Zod each time they fight. As they duke it out, Rickard can't help but be impressed with both men, and we finally learn why Skull Knight made an appearance right outside the place where Griffith's eclipse was taking place. He wanted to take another potshot at Void's exposed Brainiac dome and see whether his fellow struggler had managed to do what he had asked him to do about a year ago. After an extended battle with Zod, which he won, Skull Knight broke into the eclipse and escaped it with both Guts and Casca in tow. Skull Knight saving Casca was more of a choice thing. He had lost his own lover to the first eclipse, so he didn't want this girl to suffer the same fate. In a way, he was trying to redeem himself, but when it comes to Guts, Skull Knight basically predicted that he'd survive the abyss to spare with broken sword in hand. His involvement with the eclipse is the reason Berserk's story has continued, because had he not saved the lives of our protagonists, the series would have ended right there. That makes Skull Knight's eclipse and eclipse-adjacent appearances his second most appearance cluster, with the first being Chapters 37 and 90 through 92. In many ways, Chapter 37 can be considered the true starting point for Berserk because it features the debut of Skull Knight. In it, the Wandering Wraith meets his future fellow struggler for the first time and warns him to prepare himself because a year later is when the eclipse is supposed to take place. He warns Guts that his friends and his unkingly half will be gathered in that place, and at that time, if he doesn't do anything about it, like improving his swordsmanship skills for example, then he was doomed to die along along with the rest of the band of the Falcon. Skull Knight is aware of the fact that Guts was born from a corpse, which is information he's never revealed to anyone, not even Casca, and he claims that this is why he excels at escaping death. He says that Guts better struggle, contend, and wriggle if he wants to continue living, and as he vanishes into the night sky, Skull Knight thinks back to another prophetic proclamation, which we mentioned just a few moments ago. As he walks away, Skull Knight thinks to himself that only a man that stands in the abyss of despair with a broken sword in hand is capable of joining the hit against the God Hand, and lo and behold, here we are. So, chapter 37 is extremely important because it introduces Skull Knight as this imposing figure that knows a lot about causality and the astral world and is willing to share it with you provided you don't mess with him, and chapters 90 through 92 can be considered quite similar in nature. If chapter 37 introduced the Eclipse through Skull Knight, then chapters 90 through 92 introduced the Black Swordsman through him, complete with a breakdown on how to use his newfound circumstances to his advantage in his quest to hunt and kill all of demonkind. In the immediate aftermath of the Eclipse, as soon as Guts wakes up, he felt like nothing would be the same again, and he was right. Casca was regressed to a childlike state because of what Griffith did to her. He was having nightmares where he kept trying to tell guys like Pippin and Judo not to go along with whatever Griffith says, but alas, it was a little too late for that. After waking up to his new depressing reality, Guts sprinted out of the cave that protected both him and Casca, and when he finally got exhausted, Skull Knight gave him his own sword to survive his very first night of terrors, informing him that every night would now look the same for him. After Guts made his one-man war declaration to annihilate every astral spirit and creature that dared to stand in his way, Skull Knight took him to Casca because the demons attacking Guts had now shifted to her. There, they realized that she was actually pregnant and in labor, and that the baby inside her was hers and Guts's, which had been corrupted by Femto's demonic seed. This led to the birth of the demon child, which Skull Knight predicted would keep coming back to its parents because even if it was a demon, it still had feelings. After telling Guts that if he was truly serious about eradicating apostles from this universe, then he should keep an eye on his brand of sacrifice because the more it hurts, the closer he'll be to apostles. And before parting ways with him for the next couple of years, Skull Knight warns Guts that his path leads through the darkness, and one has to be extremely careful and mindful of who they are lest they lose themselves to the void. All of these chapters are technically firsts for them all, with 37 being Skull Knight's debut and 90 marking the birth of the Black Swordsman persona. Had neither of those chapters been published, we doubt Guts and Casca would still be alive, and Berserk would be the masterpiece that it is today. This is why our top pick for Skull Knight's most important appearances are chapters 37, 90, 91, and 92, because without those, neither Berserk nor Skull Knight's own backstory would make much sense at all. Marvelous verdict. Unfortunately, that's all we got for you guys today. Let us know your thoughts on which Skull Knight appearance is the most important in the comments down below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Berserk content. We'll see you guys real soon with yet another video, so until then, stay safe and keep on struggling, strugglers.